It was quiet. Perfectly, completely quiet. Hermione Granger sat in the center of Department of Mysteries Lab 4. The only sound was the scratch of her quill on parchment. She liked it this way. No people, no noise, just the work. The ministry above her was a chaotic mess of politics and posturing, but down here in the buried depths of the department, logic ruled. Magic was a puzzle, and she was the one who solved it. She had retreated down here a decade ago, exhausted by the relentless demands of a wizarding world that wanted her to be a symbol. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to be left alone with things that made sense. Runes made sense. Arithmancy made sense. People did not. She had ink stains smudged on the side of her left hand, and her hair was pinned up haphazardly by a silver quill. She didn't care how she looked. She hadn't looked in a mirror since Tuesday, caring only about the 15th century warding scroll spread across her desk. She needed to finish translating it before midnight. It was a complex sequence. The ancient magic twisted in on itself, demanding absolute precision. She dipped her quill, wrote another rune, and frowned. Something was wrong. The air in the lab grew heavy. It felt thick. Hard to breathe. Like the pressure before a thunderstorm, but trapped in a stone room 50 feet below ground. Hermione put the quill down. She stood up. She looked at the far wall. The stone was vibrating. That wasn't right. The structural wards were built to withstand a direct blast from a Hungarian horntail. They didn't vibrate. They didn't hum. She took a step forward. "Finite incantatum," she said. Nothing happened. The vibrating grew louder. A low hum. Then a high, shrieking pitch that hurt her teeth. Her wand was on the desk. She reached for it. She didn't make it in time. The wall exploded inward. Stone shattered. Glass broke. The force of the blast hit her like a physical blow. The noise was absolute. She flew backward. She hit the far wall. Hard. Pain flared in her head. Her ribs. Her shoulder. She fell to the floor. Dust filled the air. She couldn't breathe. She coughed. Blood tasted like copper in her mouth. She tried to move. She couldn't. The world was spinning too fast. Everything went black. Bright light. Too bright. Hermione blinked. Her head throbbed. Every muscle in her body ached with a dull, heavy pulse. She tried to sit up. A sharp pain shot through her side, stealing her breath. "Don't move." The voice was familiar. Safe. She turned her head. Slowly. Harry Potter sat in a chair next to her bed. His hair was a mess. He had dark circles under his eyes. He looked exhausted. He was wearing his formal aura robes, which meant he had been on duty when they called him. She was in the Ministry Medical Wing. White walls. White sheets. The sharp smell of medicinal potions and sterile charms. What happened? She asked. Her voice was raspy. It hurt to speak. "Your lab was attacked," Harry said. "I know that." Hermione said. "The wall exploded." "But how?" "The wards, they are ancient. They are tied to the bedrock of London. The wards were bypassed from the inside." Harry said. He leaned forward. He didn't look like her best friend right now. He looked like the head auror. Cold. Focused. Professional. This wasn't an accident, Hermione. I didn't think it was. It's the 4th time. Hermione frowned. The movement made her headache worse. 4th time for what? Sabotage, Harry said. Your work has been tampered with for weeks. Small things. A missing file. A broken crystal matrix. A mistranslated rune sequence. We've been tracking it. You didn't tell me. We didn't want to panic you. We thought it was low-level harassment. Petty rivalry in the department. Harry rubbed his eyes behind his glasses. He looked older than 28. We were wrong, he said. This wasn't petty. This was a targeted strike. Someone tried to kill you tonight. Hermione studied him. The words didn't make sense. Kill her? Why? She was a researcher. She translated old scrolls. She didn't fight dark wizards anymore. She had left that life behind a decade ago. That's ridiculous, she said. Is it? Harry asked. You were thrown across a room. You have 3 broken ribs and a severe concussion. If the internal shielding in that lab hadn't held, you'd be dead. She pressed the pad of her thumb into the edge of her mattress. She pressed until the knuckle went white. It was the only way to ground herself against the sudden, rising panic. Who? She asked. We don't know yet. But we are taking it seriously now. Good. Catch them. We will, Harry said. But until we do, things are changing. What things? Your security protocols. I work in the Department of Mysteries. Hermione said. My security protocols are fine. They failed tonight. It was a fluke. It was an assassination attempt. She glared at him. He didn't blink. He had fought a war. He wasn't going to back down from a glare. Fine. Hermione said. I'll double the wards on my flat. I'll take a secure portkey to work. No, Harry said. You aren't going to your flat. And you aren't going to work. Excuse me? You are going to a safe house. I have a deadline on Friday. You have a target on your back, Harry said. His voice was firm. You are going to a safe house. And you are getting a full-time protection detail. Hermione crossed her arms. Or tried to. Her ribs hurt too much. She settled for gripping the sheets. I don't need a babysitter, Harry. It's not a negotiation, Hermione. I can protect myself. You couldn't tonight. The words stung. She hated feeling weak. She hated losing control. Her entire life in the department was built on control. Understanding the rules. Mastering the magic. This felt like being dragged backward in time, back to when they were always running, always looking over their shoulders, waiting for the next curse to fly out of the dark. She refused to go back to that. Harry, please, she said. Her voice dropped, softening for the first time. I just need my lab. I need my space. If you put guards at my door, I'll never be able to focus. Your lab is currently a crater, Hermione, Harry said gently. You can't go back there. Then find me another workspace. Not until we know who did this. And not until we catch them.
Who?
She asked. Who are you assigning to me? Give me Ron. Ron is in Berlin on a smuggling case. He won't be back for 3 weeks. Give me Dawlish. Give me anyone from the second squad. I'll even take Proudfoot. The door to the medical wing clicked open. They are all busy, Granger. The voice was quiet. Clipped. Polite to the point of being weaponized. Hermione froze. Draco Malfoy walked into the room. He wore an immaculately tailored black suit instead of robes. The muggle suit fit him perfectly. His blonde hair was neat, and his pale eyes were completely unreadable. He moved with slow, deliberate efficiency, no longer looking like the boy she knew in school. He looked like a very dangerous man. He had been an Auror for 8 years with the highest closure rate in the department, carrying a reputation for being entirely ruthless. He stopped at the foot of her bed. Malfoy. Hermione said. Granger. She looked at Harry. No. Absolutely not. Harry sighed. He rubbed his temples. Harry, tell me this is a joke, Hermione said. Tell me this is a terrible, poorly timed joke. It's not a joke. Harry said. He's a senior Auror. He doesn't do protection details. He investigates homicides. He does this one. Harry said. Hermione looked back at Malfoy. He stood perfectly still. He didn't look annoyed. He didn't look bored. He looked like he was cataloguing every exit in the room, checking the structural integrity of the windows, and calculating the distance to the door. I don't need him, she said. You do, Malfoy said. His voice was completely flat. Because clearly, left to your own devices, you blow yourself up. I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself, Hermione snapped. Her logic was failing. She was getting flustered. She hated getting flustered. I have the highest marks in defensive magic in the history of the department. I know over 400 shield variations. I can duel 3 people at once. Malfoy tilted his head. Just slightly. Fascinating, he said. Tell me, Granger. Precisely how many of those 400 shield variations did you manage to cast while flying backward into a stone wall tonight? Silence. Hermione's mouth opened. Then closed. She pressed her thumb harder into the mattress. She wanted to throw a potion vial at his head. That was an ambush. She said. Assassins rarely send invitations, Malfoy replied. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't mock her. He just stated a fact. It was infuriating. I don't want you here, Hermione said. Your preferences were not factored into the Ministry's risk assessment. I will file a formal complaint. I will speak to the Minister. You can file it tomorrow. From the safe house. I'm not going to a safe house with you. We will kill each other. Malfoy looked at Harry. Is she always this difficult? Yes, Harry said. Literally always. Since she was 11. I'm sitting right here, Hermione said. Harry stood up. He physically stepped between them. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who just wanted to go home and sleep for a week. Hermione, listen to me, Harry said. "This is a done deal. Malfoy is the best we have. He pulled rank to take this assignment. He is going to keep you alive. Let him do his job." Hermione watched Harry closely. Then she turned her gaze to Malfoy. Malfoy didn't react to Harry's statement. He didn't confirm he pulled rank. He didn't explain why a senior Auror would voluntarily take a babysitting job. He just watched her. She hated this. She hated the loss of her lab, the loss of her work, the loss of her independence. But most of all, she hated the way Malfoy looked at her. Like she was a puzzle he was determined to solve. Like she was a problem he had to fix. "Fine," she said. Her voice was cold. "Excellent," Malfoy said. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just accepted the victory. He turned to the door. He dismissed the hovering Mediwitch with a quiet, polite word. The witch scurried out, looking terrified of him. Malfoy turned back to Hermione. His pale, unreadable eyes focused fully on her. "Get dressed, Granger," he said. "We're leaving." The Scottish Highlands were freezing in November. The wind howled against the stone walls of the safe house, a vicious, biting sound that normally would have set Draco Malfoy's teeth on edge. Tonight, he welcomed the noise. It meant the perimeter wards were holding. If someone breached the boundary line, the wind would drop. Absolute silence was the first sign of an attack. He had learned that the hard way during his first year in the Auror Corps. He never forgot a lesson that involved bleeding out on a cobblestone street. He stood in the center of the cramped sitting room. He did not take off his suit jacket. He did not loosen his tie. He raised his right hand. A pulse of silver magic rippled from his fingers. It coated the heavy oak front door, locking the deadbolts, sealing the hinges, and layering a localized repelling charm over the wood. He didn't use a wand for it. Wandless magic left no residual trace for tracking spells to lock onto. It also required immense focus. He turned to the windows. He dragged his hand through the air. The heavy curtains snapped shut. Another pulse of magic sealed the glass. His heart was still beating too fast. It had been beating too fast since Potter's Patronus burst into his office 3 hours ago. Lab 4 explosion. Granger inside. Suspected sabotage. Draco had stopped breathing. He remembered the feeling perfectly. A sudden, violent void in the center of his chest. He hadn't waited for orders. He hadn't asked for permission. He had simply walked into the head Auror's office, dropped his current homicide case file on the desk, and demanded the detail. Potter had taken one look at Draco's face and signed the authorization. Now, he was here. She was alive. She was currently pacing the length of the sitting room behind him. And she was entirely furious. "This is ridiculous," Hermione said. She walked from the fireplace to the sealed door. She turned on her heel. She walked back. "I have work to do, Malfoy. I cannot be locked in a glorified hunting lodge for an undetermined amount of time because some incompetent saboteur got lucky." Draco didn't look at her. If he looked at her, he would see the bruise blooming along her jawline. He would see the way she held her left arm stiffly against her side to protect her broken ribs. He would remember seeing her lying in the rubble of her lab, covered in dust and blood, looking entirely too small. If he remembered that, he might lose the tight, iron grip he had on his professionalism. And right now, professionalism was the only thing keeping him from tearing the ministry apart to find whoever did this to her. They didn't get lucky, Draco said. His voice was quiet, clipped, completely even. They bypassed a level 7 ministry ward matrix. That requires internal clearance, significant magical output, and precise timing. It was a highly organized attempt on your life. It was a localized explosion, Hermione countered. Probably an unstable potion component in the adjacent lab. You don't share a wall with an adjacent lab. You share a wall with solid bedrock. He moved to the fireplace. He cast a localized damping charm on the chimney flue. No flue travel in. No flue travel out. I am a senior researcher, Hermione said. She crossed her arms, winced at the movement, and dropped them again. I have rights as a ministry employee. You cannot sequester me without a formal tribunal review. Draco finally turned around. He looked at her. Really looked at her. Her hair was falling out of its messy knot. There was a smudge of soot on her forehead. She was vibrating with indignant rage. It was a defense mechanism. He knew it. She was terrified of losing control, so she was trying to argue the terror away with ministry bylaws. It was utterly predictable. And utterly brilliant. He pulled a folded piece of parchment from the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He held it out to her. What is this? She asked. The rules of your continued existence, Draco said. She snatched the parchment from his hand. Her fingers brushed his. He ignored the sudden spike of heat where her skin touched his. He adjusted his left cufflink with his right thumb. A microscopic movement. Hermione scanned the parchment. She went perfectly still. No flue access, she read aloud. No owl post. No standing within 3 feet of an exterior window. No unauthorized wand magic. She looked up. She glared at him. No unauthorized wand magic? She repeated. You want to confiscate my magic? I want to confiscate your ability to leave a magical signature that can be tracked by a motivated assassin, Draco said smoothly. Every spell casts a unique resonance. If they are looking for you, they are sweeping for your specific resonance. You will cast nothing without my explicit approval. I am not a prisoner. You are a target. My job is to ensure you do not become a casualty. I need to work. She yelled. I need to translate the warding scroll. The scroll is secure in the Department of Mysteries. It is halfway finished. The translation degrades if left incomplete for too long. Then it will degrade. I will not let a decade of research rot because you are overly paranoid. She reached into the pocket of her jeans. She pulled out her wand. The vine wood looked dangerous in her hand. Draco went entirely still. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Put it away, Granger, he said softly. This room is freezing. Hermione snapped. You haven't lit the fire. If I can't use the flue, I can at least cast a simple warming charm. I said, put it away. She raised the wand. Draco moved. He didn't draw his own wand. He didn't need to. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long, silent strides. Before she could form the first syllable of the incantation, his hand clamped down on her wrist. His grip was iron tight. Not enough to bruise, but enough to completely arrest her movement. Hermione gasped. She looked up at him. Draco glared down at her. He was taller than her by several inches. He used every bit of that height to loom over her. He let the polite, professional mask slip, just for a fraction of a second. His pale grey eyes blazed with a terrifying, violent intensity. It was the look of a man who had ended lives to protect the Ministry. The look of an apex predator. "You will not cast a spell," he said. His voice was a whisper, but it echoed in the small room. "You will not stand near the windows. You will not send an owl. You will do exactly as I say, when I say it." Hermione stopped breathing. She stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "Because if you do not," Draco continued, leaning in just a fraction of an inch, "they will find you. And I will have to kill them. And I deeply prefer not to get blood on this suit. Do you understand me?" They were inches apart. He could smell the dust from the explosion on her clothes. He could smell the sharp tang of fear and adrenaline. He could see the pulse beating wildly at the base of her throat. He realized, with a sickening jolt, how badly he wanted to trace that pulse with his mouth. He let go of her wrist immediately. He stepped back, locking his expression down. The cold, unreadable mask slammed back into place so fast it was almost audible. "Do you understand me, Granger?" he repeated, his voice returning to its flat, polite cadence. Hermione rubbed her wrist. She didn't look away from him. The defiance was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. Confusion. A sudden, hyper-awareness of the physical space between them. The physical contact had left a burning tension in the room. It was heavy. It was undeniable. "You are completely mad," she said quietly. "I am completely thorough. I have rights as a Ministry employee," she said, though the argument lacked its previous heat. She was reciting facts to steady herself. Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the Magical Lore Enforcement Guidelines explicitly states that a protectee must not be subjected to undue distress. Draco smoothed the front of his jacket. A standard Ministry coffin is precisely 6 feet long by 2 feet wide, Granger, he said. Lined with cheap velvet. It is remarkably distressing. I am saving you the experience. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She pressed her thumb into the seam of her jeans. I'm going to make tea, she announced abruptly. The kitchen is secure. Do not use the stove. I will heat the water, he said. She glared at him. I am capable of boiling water. Wandless magic only, he reminded her. She turned and marched toward the small kitchen archway. Her limp was pronounced. She was in pain. Draco watched her go, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to stop himself from reaching out to help her. He couldn't help her. If he showed an ounce of softness, she would exploit it to gain independence. And independence would get her killed. He walked to the hard wooden chair positioned by the front door and sat down. He pulled his wand from its holster and rested it loosely on his knee. He cast a sensory extension charm out into the howling wind of the Highlands, tying the perimeter wards directly to his own magical core. If anything crossed the boundary line, he would feel it in his blood before they took a single step toward the house. From down the hall, he heard the clatter of a kettle in the kitchen. A few minutes later, Hermione walked back into the hallway. She held a steaming mug of tea. She stopped when she saw him, She looked at the hard chair. She looked at his wand. She looked at his posture, rigid and completely alert. "There's a bedroom upstairs," she said. "I am aware." "You're not sleeping?" she asked. Draco didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the heavy oak door. "I'm working," he replied. He heard her sigh. It was a soft, exasperated sound. She didn't argue. She turned and walked up the narrow wooden stairs. Draco sat in the dark. He listened to the wind. He listened to the creak of the floorboards above him as she moved around the bedroom. He adjusted his left cufflink. He had 10 years of practice keeping his distance from Hermione Granger. He had perfected the art of observing her from across the ministry atrium, reading her published papers, and quietly ensuring her research funding was never cut. He had built a fortress of professional detachment to hide the fact that he was completely, irrevocably devoted to her. Sitting in the freezing dark of a Highland safe house, listening to her breathe on the floor above him, Draco realized something terrifying. The fortress wasn't going to hold. It had been raining for 3 straight days. The Scottish Highlands were apparently determined to drown them. The relentless drumming against the roof of the safe house was the only sound that broke the oppressive silence. Hermione was going out of her mind. She sat at the small, scarred kitchen table. Her ribs ached a dull, persistent throb. She ignored it. She was trying to reconstruct the 15th century warding scroll entirely from memory. Since Malfoy had confiscated her wand and forbidden any magical communication, she was using a muggle biro and a stack of lined paper she found in a drawer. It was day 4. They had not killed each other yet. It was a near thing. She scratched a line through a complex rune sequence. It was wrong. The primary anchor in the sequence needed to be reversed to account for the lunar cycle phase of the original casting. She knew that. Why had she drawn it upright? She pressed the pad of her thumb hard against the plastic barrel of the pen. Across the room, Draco Malfoy sat in a high-backed armchair. He was reading a massive, heavily redacted aura field report. He hadn't turned a page in 5 minutes. He hadn't moved at all. He had changed out of the suit on the second day, replacing it with a dark grey jumper and black trousers. It didn't make him look any less dangerous. It just made him look like a predator that was comfortable in its cage. He was infuriatingly competent. She hated admitting it, even to herself. But she had watched him over the past 72 hours. He didn't sleep in a bed. He dozed in the hard chair by the door for exactly 2 hours at a time. He checked the perimeter wards every 4 hours. He cooked simple, functional meals entirely by hand. He didn't complain. He didn't gloat. He simply existed in a state of absolute, unbreakable vigilance. He was doing exactly what Harry promised he would do. He was keeping her alive. She hated it. She hated needing him. Hermione drew another rune. The ink blotted on the cheap paper. "Damn it," she muttered. She pressed the pen down harder. The plastic barrel snapped. Ink exploded across her fingers and stained the partially finished runic circle on the page. Hermione dropped the broken pieces. She glared at the black ink bleeding into the paper. It felt like a massive, insurmountable defeat. Her lab was gone. Her work was ruined. She was trapped in the middle of nowhere with a man who looked at her like she was a security risk. She closed her eyes. She took a slow, shuddering breath, determined not to let the frustration break her. The tertiary sequence is floored. The voice was quiet. Neutral. Hermione's eyes snapped open. She looked across the room. Malfoy hadn't looked up from his report. He was still gazing at the parchment in his lap. "Excuse me?" she said. "The tertiary sequence," he repeated smoothly. He finally turned a page of his report. "You were trying to anchor a localized compression ward using a standard arithmetic bridge. It won't hold. The bridge is too rigid for the pressure. It will shatter." Hermione watched him. She looked down at her ruined paper. He was right. That was exactly where she kept getting stuck. "How do you know what I'm doing?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "You mutter," Malfoy said. Loudly. "I do not mutter. You spent the last 20 minutes debating the structural integrity of a modified Aegis shield with yourself. You lost the debate." Hermione felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks. She wiped her inky fingers on a napkin. "A modified Aegis is perfectly stable if you anchor it to the ambient magic of the structure," she argued automatically. She couldn't help it. It was academic reflex. Malfoy finally looked up from his report. His pale grey eyes met hers across the small kitchen. "Ambient magic fluctuates," he said. "If the temperature drops rapidly, the magic contracts. The Aegis shield requires a constant power source. If it contracts, the shield drops. Not if you weave a stabilizing rune into the primary matrix, which slows the deployment speed by 2 seconds. Malfoy closed his folder. He rested it on the small table next to his chair. 2 seconds is an eternity in a duel. A combat shield must be instantaneous. You sacrifice stability for speed. Always. I am not designing combat shields for duels, Hermione said, sitting up straighter. The ache in her ribs sharpened, but she ignored it. I design structural wards. They don't need to deploy in 2 seconds. They need to withstand sustained siege. And yet, your lab exploded, he pointed out. It was a low blow. He delivered it without malice, simply stating a fact. Hermione bristled. My structural wards held perfectly against external force. The saboteur bypassed them from the inside. They altered the internal pressure matrix. Which proves my point, Malfoy said smoothly. He leaned back in his chair. A static ward is vulnerable to manipulation. A dynamic, combat-oriented shield adapts. If you had designed the lab's wards to shift their frequency every hour, the saboteur couldn't have anchored their explosive charge. Shifting frequencies destabilize the very artifacts I am paid to study. Better a destabilized artifact than a dead senior researcher. Hermione opened her mouth to argue. She closed it. She looked at him. Really looked at him. The sharp lines of his jaw. The utter stillness of his posture. The intelligence burning behind those pale, unreadable eyes. She had known, abstractly, that he was smart. He had always been right behind her in class rankings. But they had never actually talked like this. They had never debated magical theory. It had always been insults and sneers and bad blood. He wasn't sneering now. He was engaging. He was arguing magical theory with her on a level that very few people in the Department of Mysteries could manage. He understood the complex arithmancy she was using. He just applied it differently. She built fortresses. He built weapons. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He was brilliant. And he was bored. He was sitting in this freezing cabin, reading the same redacted report for 3 days, because he was guarding her. You would use a shifting frequency, she said slowly. Her voice lost its sharp edge. Malfoy tilted his head. Just a fraction. I would use a randomized cipher, he corrected. Tied to your own magical signature. Only you could access the lab. Only you could alter the pressure matrix. Anyone else who stepped through the door would trigger an immediate lockdown. A personalized cipher, Hermione murmured. She looked down at her inky hands. She thought about the math required for that. It was staggering. It would take weeks to calculate the correct equations. I could calculate it in 3 hours. It wasn't a boast. He said it with the same flat certainty he used to describe the weather. Hermione looked back up at him. The air in the room felt different. The oppressive, suffocating tension of the past 3 days had shifted. It hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a cage. It was a live wire. 3 hours? She challenged, raising an eyebrow. Malfoy's mouth twitched. It was the absolute ghost of a smirk. 2.5, if you stopped muttering. Hermione let out a short, startled laugh. It was a rusty sound. She hadn't laughed since before the explosion. Malfoy studied her. The ghost of the smirk vanished. He looked at her mouth, then quickly looked away. He stood up. The sudden movement was jarring after hours of absolute stillness. I'm going to check the perimeter, he announced. His voice was clipped again. The professional mask had slammed back into place. In the rain? Hermione asked. The rain obscures visibility. It is the optimal time for an approach. He didn't wait for an answer. He walked to the front door, cast a localized waterproofing charm over himself, and stepped out into the storm. Hermione sat at the kitchen table. She looked at the broken pen. She felt entirely unsettled. She spent the next hour trying to clean the ink off her hands. It was stubborn. Without magic, she had to scrub her skin raw with harsh muggle soap. When Malfoy returned, he was dripping wet. His hair was plastered to his forehead. He didn't look cold. He just looked dangerous again. He locked the door. He sealed the wards. He stripped off his wet jacket and hung it by the fire. He didn't speak to her. He moved to the small kitchen. Hermione watched him from the table. She expected him to go back to his chair and his report. Instead, he pulled the kettle from the stove. He didn't use a warming charm. He lit the gas burner manually. He waited for the water to boil. He moved with that same deliberate efficiency. A few minutes later, he walked over to the table. He set a steaming mug of tea in front of her. Hermione examined the mug. It was perfectly brewed. Exactly the color she liked. She looked up at him. He was standing very close. He smelled like rain and ozone and something dark and completely his own. Thank you, she said quietly. Malfoy didn't reply. He looked down at her hands. The knuckles were red from scrubbing, but the ink was mostly gone. He reached out. For a second, Hermione thought he was going to take the mug back. But his hand bypassed the porcelain. His long, pale fingers brushed against her knuckles. The contact was featherlight. A fleeting, almost accidental touch. But it wasn't accidental. He didn't pull away immediately. The heat of his skin against her sent a sharp, electric jolt straight up her arm. Her breath caught in her throat. She went perfectly still. He looked at her hands. Then he looked at her face. His pale eyes were no longer unreadable. They were entirely focused, tracking the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the slight parting of her lips. The air in the room felt thick again, but it wasn't the heavy pressure of a warding spell. It was something else entirely. It was gravity. Malfoy slowly pulled his hand back. He curled his fingers into a loose fist. "You missed a spot," he said. His voice was a low rasp. He turned and walked back to his chair. Hermione sat at the table. She wrapped both hands around the hot mug of tea. She was shivering, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the cold. The hostility was gone. Something much more dangerous had taken its place. Night 6. The rain had finally stopped. The Highland air was freezing, settling over the safe house in a thick, suffocating layer of frost. Draco Malfoy was dozing in the hard wooden chair by the front door. He wasn't asleep. He hadn't truly slept in a week. He existed in a state of suspended twilight, his magical core stretched thin, woven into the perimeter wards surrounding the cabin. He could feel the ambient temperature of the frost. He could feel the small animals moving through the distant tree line. He could hear Hermione breathing on the second floor. It had been 3 days since the incident with the tea. They hadn't spoken about it. They hadn't needed to. The silence between them had fundamentally changed. It was no longer hostile. It was heavily, dangerously loaded. Every time she walked into a room, he felt a localized spike of adrenaline. Every time she looked at him, he felt the terrifying urge to cross the room and pull her apart. He kept his distance. He kept his professional mask bolted into place. It was the only way to keep her safe. At 2:14 a.m., the wards didn't just trip. They were violently, catastrophically torn down. Draco felt it before he heard it. The sensory extension charm tied to his blood snapped with a vicious backlash of raw magic. It felt like a physical blow to his sternum. He was out of the chair and moving before his conscious mind registered the pain. "Granger!" he roared. The silence of the Highland night shattered. The heavy oak front door the door Draco had reinforced with 3 layers of wandless magic exploded inward. Splinters of wood the size of daggers shredded the air. Draco threw up a non-verbal Protego Maximer, catching the brunt of the shrapnel on a shimmering silver shield. The force of the explosion blew the windows out. Glass rained across the sitting room floor. 2 figures stepped through the ruined doorway. They wore dark, tactical robes. Their faces were obscured by blank silver masks. Professional mercenaries. Expensive ones. The first mercenary raised a wand. A jet of sickly green light illuminated the dark room. Draco didn't block it. You couldn't block the killing curse. He sidestepped with liquid speed, firing a bone-shattering hex directly at the man's knee. The hex connected. The mercenary went down with a wet crunch. "Malfoy!" Hermione was at the top of the stairs. She was wearing an oversized jumper and pajama bottoms. She looked terrified, but she wasn't freezing. She was already scanning the room, analyzing the threat. "Get down!" Draco shouted. The second mercenary fired a blasting curse at the staircase. Draco didn't think. He didn't calculate the risk. He moved entirely on instinct. He crossed the room in a blur of motion, intercepting the curse with a localized compression shield just before it hit the wooden banister. The shield held, but the kinetic feedback threw him backward. He hit the floor hard. He rolled to his feet instantly. Kitchen! He barked at her. Hermione didn't argue. She scrambled down the stairs, keeping her head low, and dove behind the heavy stone island in the small kitchen. Draco fired a blinding hex, followed by a severing charm. The second mercenary deflected both, moving with a disciplined efficiency that told Draco exactly how bad this situation was. These weren't thugs. These were trained killers. A third figure stepped through the ruined doorway. 3 of them. Draco fell back. He laid down a suppressing fire of rapid, non-verbal stunners, forcing the attackers to take cover behind the shattered remains of the front door. He used the brief window to dive over the counter, landing in the cramped space next to Hermione. She was pressed flat against the cabinets. Her breathing was fast, but she wasn't panicking. Her mind was working. "Give me my wand," she demanded. Her voice was a fierce whisper. "No. Malfoy, there are 3 of them. I can count. Granger." A curse shattered the stone counter above their heads. Dust and debris rained down on them. Draco physically threw himself over her, shielding her body with his own. He pressed her down against the floor. He could smell her shampoo. He could feel the rapid, frantic beat of her heart against his chest. It was intensely, terrifyingly distracting. He rolled off her, keeping his head below the counter line. "Give me the wand," she hissed, grabbing his forearm. "If you cast a spell, they will lock onto your magical signature." Draco snapped. "That is how they found us. The wards didn't fail. They tracked the residual magic from your lab explosion. Then let them track me. I'm not going to let you fight them alone. You will stay exactly where you are," Draco said. His voice was absolute. "If you stand up, you die. If you cast a spell, you die. You will stay down. Do you understand me? I can help you. You can help me by not getting killed while I'm trying to do my job." Another curse hit the counter. A massive chunk of stone sheared off, missing Draco's head by inches. Hermione flinched. She looked at the destruction, then looked back at him. "They're using a synchronized overlapping offensive pattern," she whispered rapidly, her academic brain kicking into gear. "It's an old aura tactic. If one drops their shield to cast, the other covers them. You can't break through a synchronized shield with direct fire." "I am aware of standard combat tactics, Granger. You have to disrupt their rhythm. If you cast a localized vacuum hex, shut up and stay down," Draco ordered. He didn't have time for a tactical debate. The mercenaries were advancing. He could hear their boots crunching on the broken glass in the sitting room. They were fanning out, trying to flank the kitchen island. Draco checked his wand. The wood was warm in his hand. He took a slow breath. He buried his fear deep, locking it away behind years of occlumency. He couldn't be afraid. Fear made you slow. "Cover your ears," he told her. She opened her mouth to argue. He shot her a glare so venomous it silenced her instantly. She pressed her hands over her ears. Draco popped up from behind the counter. He didn't cast a standard offensive spell. He didn't use a stunner. He cast a modified Bombarder Maximer directly at the ceiling support beam directly above the mercenaries. The spell hit with a deafening roar. The heavy wooden beam splintered and collapsed, bringing a massive section of the ceiling down with it. The synchronized shield the mercenaries were holding fractured under the physical weight of the falling debris. Draco didn't hesitate. Before the dust could settle, he vaulted over the kitchen island. He was a blur of lethal, focused motion. He fired a severing charm that caught the first mercenary across the chest. The man went down, screaming. The second mercenary tried to pivot, raising his wand to cast a killing curse. Draco was faster. He didn't use magic. He crossed the distance, grabbed the man's wand arm, and snapped his wrist with a brutal, sickening twist. As the mercenary dropped his wand, Draco drove his elbow into the man's throat. The mercenary collapsed, gagging for air. The third attacker, the one Draco had hit in the knee earlier, had managed to pull himself upright. He leveled his wand at Draco's back. "Malfoy, behind you!" Hermione screamed from the kitchen. Draco spun. He brought his shield up, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. A jagged, dark purple curse tore through his shield and hit him high in the left shoulder. The pain was blinding. It felt like liquid fire pouring directly into his veins. It was a necrotic curse, designed to eat through tissue and bone. Draco stumbled backward. He didn't fall. He gritted his teeth against the agony, raised his right arm, and cast a silent, devastating concussion hex. The spell hit the third mercenary square in the chest. The man flew backward, through the ruined front doorway, and landed motionless in the frosted grass outside. Silence descended on the safe house. The only sounds were the howling wind tearing through the broken windows, the groaning of the damaged ceiling, and Draco's own ragged, uneven breathing. He stood in the center of the wreckage. His left arm hung useless at his side. Blood thick, dark, and hot was pouring down his sleeve, dripping steadily onto the shattered glass covering the floor. He turned toward the kitchen. "Granger," he said. His voice was hoarse. She was already moving. She scrambled over the rubble, completely ignoring the shards of broken glass cutting into her bare feet. She didn't look at the unconscious mercenaries groaning in the frost outside. She didn't look at the destroyed ceiling of the safe house or the debris raining down around them. She looked only at him, her entire focus narrowed to the man bleeding in the center of the room. She closed the distance between them in seconds. She didn't ask if he was okay because it was painfully obvious he was not. She looked at the wound on his shoulder, her academic mind instantly recognizing the signature of the spell. The dark magic was eating at the edges of his grey jumper, the blood spreading rapidly and staining the fabric a terrifying, impenetrable black. "Sit down," she ordered. Her voice shook, but she didn't hesitate. Draco dropped heavily onto the edge of the ruined sofa. He was losing blood fast. The necrotic curse was spreading, sending waves of nauseating pain through his chest. Hermione dropped to her knees in front of him. She pressed both of her hands firmly against his shoulder. Draco hissed in pain. His head fell back against the cushions. "I know," Hermione said. "I know it hurts. I need you to give me my wand, Malfoy." "No. I have to stop the bleeding. The curse is necrotic. It requires a specific countercharm." "No magic," Draco ground out. He forced his eyes open. He looked at her. They will track you. They already found us. These were contractors, Draco said, his words slightly slurred from the blood loss. Expendable. If you cast a spell, the person who hired them will know exactly where you are. They will send more. If I don't cast a spell, you are going to bleed to death on this sofa. I have survived worse. You are an idiot. She yelled at him. Tears of sheer frustration and terror were welling in her eyes. Give me the bloody wand. I am not letting you expose yourself. Hermione pressed harder against his shoulder. The blood was seeping through her fingers, hot and sticky. Her hands were shaking violently. She was inches from him. Her face was pale, smeared with dust from the collapsed ceiling. Her hair was a wild, chaotic mess. Draco looked at her. The adrenaline in his system was burning away the last of his professional detachment. The heavy, iron-clad fortress he had built around himself for 10 years was gone. It had shattered the moment the front door exploded. He didn't care about the ministry. He didn't care about his career, or his spotless record, or the careful detachment he had cultivated for a decade. All of that was ash. He only cared that she was alive. He cared that she was here, breathing, arguing with him, pressing her small hands against his bleeding shoulder with fierce, desperate strength. He reached up with his good right hand and covered her bloody hands with his own, entirely anchoring himself in the warmth of her palms. Her breath hitched. She stopped yelling. She gazed at him. The air in the ruined sitting room went perfectly still. The wind howling outside faded into white noise. There was only the heat of her skin, the frantic beating of her pulse, and the dark, unreadable depth of her eyes. The mask was completely gone. He wasn't the senior Auror right now. He wasn't the bodyguard. He was just a man who had nearly watched her die twice in 1 week. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. It wasn't an accidental touch this time. It was deliberate. It was anchoring. He looked at her, his pale grey eyes completely stripped of their defences. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was a roar, quiet rasp. It held more vulnerability in 3 words than he had shown anyone in a decade. Hermione watched him. A single tear slipped down her cheek, cutting a track through the dust on her face. "No," she whispered. "Good." Draco closed his eyes. The pain finally overwhelmed him. His hand slipped off hers, falling heavily to his side. He passed out. The side-along apparition was a disaster. Hermione had an apparat with unconscious deadweight in over a decade. The magic twisted violently, tearing them out of the ruined Scottish safehouse and slamming them onto the hardwood floor of a dingy flat in South London. They hit the ground hard. Hermione scrambled backward, her hands slick with blood. His blood. Draco didn't move. He lay perfectly still on the worn rug, his face ashen, his breathing shallow and erratic. "Malfoy," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Malfoy, wake up." He didn't answer. Panic, sharp and blinding, clawed at her throat. She had known the backup location. Harry had forced her to memorize it on day 1. A secondary, unplottable safehouse, stripped down to the bare essentials. No flue. No wards beyond a basic muggle-repelling charm. Total radio silence. It was freezing inside the flat. The windows were boarded up. The only light came from the orange glow of a street lamp filtering through the cracks. Hermione dragged herself across the floor to him. The necrotic curse was spreading. The dark purple lines branching out from the wound on his shoulder were crawling steadily toward his neck. The flesh around the impact site looked charred, the dark magic literally consuming him. She needed to stop it. She looked at her hands. They were trembling violently. She wiped them on her pajama trousers, leaving stark, red smears across the cotton. She lunged for the small, battered trunk sitting in the corner of the room. Emergency supplies. She tore the lid open. Inside were a few standard potions, some gauze, and a spare wand. She looked at the wand. It was a ministry-issue loaner. Standard ash wood. If she cast a spell, they could track her. The saboteurs had found the first safe house by tracing the residual magic from her lab. If she used magic now, in an unwarded location, it would light them up like a flare in the dark. She looked back at Draco. He was dying. The man who had spent 6 days driving her insane with his relentless, suffocating rules. The man who had pulled rank to protect her. The man who had just taken a curse meant for her spine. There was no choice. Hermione grabbed the wand. She crawled back to his side. She knelt on the hard floor. The air in the flat felt heavy, thick with the smell of copper and ozone. "I'm sorry," she whispered, even though he couldn't hear her. "I'm going to have to cast." She placed her left hand firmly on his uninjured shoulder. The muscle beneath her palm was rigid, locked in the throes of dark magic shock. She raised the loner wand with her right hand. She took a slow, shuddering breath, anchoring herself in the academic certainty of the spell. She knew the counter-curse. She had studied it. It was incredibly complex, requiring a sustained, focused output of pure light magic to burn away the necrosis. She began the incantation. Her voice shook on the first syllable, but the academic reflex took over. The Latin syllables fell from her lips in a rapid, continuous stream. The wand sparked. A bright, searing white light shot from the tip, hitting the center of the wound. Draco seized. His entire body arched off the floor. A roar, guttural sound tore from his throat. Hermione didn't stop. She poured everything she had into the spell, pushing the white light deeper into the blackened tissue. The dark purple veins on his skin began to recede, fighting against her magic. It felt like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a wooden door. The ambient magic in the tiny flat spiked, the air crackling with pressure. She held the spell for 2 agonizing minutes. Her magical core, already drained from the panicked apparition, began to scream in protest. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. Finally, the dark magic snapped. The necrotic tissue stopped spreading. The wound remained, raw and bleeding, but the consuming rot was gone. Hermione dropped the wand. She collapsed forward, resting her forehead against the floorboards next to his arm. She was gasping for air, her lungs burning. She had done it. She had stopped the curse. But the bleeding was still severe. She forced herself back up, her arms trembling with exhaustion. She grabbed a vial of blood-replenishing potion and a roll of gauze from the scattered supplies. She tore the ruined fabric of his jumper away from his shoulder. His skin was freezing. She worked mechanically, cleaning the wound with a splash of dittany. He didn't react to the pain. He was completely unresponsive. She wrapped the gauze tightly around his shoulder, pulling it across his chest to secure it. She uncorked the potion vial. She slipped her arm under his neck, lifting his head carefully. "Swallow," she ordered softly, tipping the vial against his lips. It took her an agonizingly long moment, but his throat finally worked. He swallowed the potion. Hermione carefully lowered his head back to the floor. She sat back on her heels. The silence in the flat was absolute. The adrenaline was rapidly draining out of her system, leaving behind an absolute, bone-deep exhaustion. She sat on the cold floor and watched him. He looked entirely wrong like this. Draco Malfoy was never uncomposed. He was tailored suits and quiet competence. He was sharp edges and immovable rules. He was the most controlled person she had ever met. Seeing him lying in the dirt, pale and broken, stripped away the last remaining layers of her academic detachment. She reached out. She couldn't help it. She carefully brushed a lock of pale blonde hair away from his forehead. His skin was damp with sweat, but the unnatural pallor was slowly fading as the potion did its work. His eyelids fluttered. Hermione went perfectly still. Draco drew a ragged breath. His eyes opened. They were unfocused. "Cloudy." He gazed at the cracked ceiling for a long moment, his chest rising and falling heavily. "Malfoy?" Hermione whispered. He turned his head slowly. The movement clearly cost him. He looked at her. He didn't recognize her at first. The sharp, calculating intelligence that usually defined his gaze was completely absent. He looked lost. He looked like he was still trapped in the ruined safe house, fighting a battle that had already ended. Then, his eyes locked onto her face. A roar, visceral panic swept over his features. It was a raw, naked emotion, completely stripped of any protective occlumency. "Granger," he gasped. His voice was a weak, frantic rasp. He tried to sit up. "No, don't move," Hermione said quickly, pressing her hands gently against his uninjured side. "You're safe. We're at the backup location." He didn't listen to her. He didn't seem to process the words. He pushed himself up on his right elbow, his face contorting in agony as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. "The roof," he choked out, looking frantically around the dark room. The ceiling collapsed. "I know. It's over. We got out." He reached out blindly with his right hand. His fingers found the sleeve of her jumper. He gripped the fabric so hard his knuckles turned white. He pulled himself closer to her, dragging his battered body across the rug. "Malfoy, stop," she pleaded, terrified he was going to tear the wound open again. "You're bleeding." He ignored his own blood. He ignored the pain. He pulled himself up until his face was inches from hers. He let go of her sleeve and grabbed her hand instead. His grip was desperate, anchoring himself to her like she was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. The delirium was making him frantic. He was scanning her face, his eyes darting across the soot and dirt on her skin. "Did they hit you?" "No," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I'm not hurt. You're bleeding." He touched the red smears on her pajama trousers. His hand was shaking violently. "There's blood. It's yours," she said. "It's your blood, Draco." It was the first time she had used his given name. It slipped out naturally, a soft anchor in the chaos. He stopped. The frantic scanning ceased. He looked at his own blood on her clothes, then slowly lifted his gaze back to her face. The delirium seemed to recede, just a fraction. The panic drained out of his eyes, leaving behind a terrifying, absolute vulnerability. The fortress was gone. The mask was gone. There was nothing left but the raw, unvarnished truth of what he felt. He didn't let go of her hand. He slumped forward, his strength finally failing him. His forehead came to rest against a shoulder. Hermione froze. The physical contact sent a jolt of shock straight through her core. He was incredibly heavy. He felt hot against his skin, the fever from the curse still burning through him. She could feel the erratic beat of his heart against her chest. She didn't push him away. Slowly, carefully, she wrapped her arms around him. She supported his weight, holding him upright in the cold, dark room. He let out a long, shuddering sigh. The tension bled out of his muscles. He leaned heavily into her embrace, turning his face into the curve of her neck. "I thought I lost you," he whispered against her skin. The words were barely audible, slurred with exhaustion and pain. Hermione closed her eyes. A tear escaped, sliding down her cheek and dripping onto the collar of his ruined jumper. She knew what he meant. He didn't mean he thought he had lost a ministry asset. He didn't mean he thought he had failed an assignment. The rules had fundamentally changed. The hostility was a distant memory. The professional detachment was a lie they could no longer maintain. "You didn't," Hermione said. She rested her cheek against the top of his head. "I'm right here." Draco's breathing slowed. The blood-replenishing potion was dragging him down into a forced, healing sleep. He didn't pull away. He fell asleep exactly where he was, his head resting on a shoulder, his fingers still wrapped tightly around her wrist. Hermione sat on the hard floor of the dingy flat, surrounded by the smell of blood and ozone. She held him carefully, completely unbothered by the cold. She didn't let go. The sterile, sharp smell of St. Mungo's always made Draco Malfoy restless. He sat on the edge of the narrow hospital bed, adjusting the cuffs of his freshly pressed shirt. It was a crisp, pale grey. Not a suit, but formal enough. He moved carefully. The muscle memory of the necrotic curse was still woven into his left shoulder, a dull, pulsing ache that the healers warned would linger for months. It had been 3 days since the dingy flat in South London. He hadn't seen her since. Harry Potter stood by the window, flipping through a thick parchment file. He didn't look exhausted today. He looked satisfied. The kind of grim satisfaction that only came with closing a brutal case. "The trace magic you pulled from the mercenaries matched perfectly," Harry said, not looking up from the file. "We kicked in his door yesterday at dawn." Draco tested the rotation of his left shoulder. He winced internally, but his face remained perfectly impassive. "A junior unspeakable," Draco said. It wasn't a question. "Wilkes," Harry confirmed. He tossed the file onto the small bedside table. He had been selling her research drafts to a private artifact collector in Munich. He thought he was being clever, altering the internal pressure matrices of her wards so they looked like localized miscalculations. Until she started translating the 15th century scroll. Draco said smoothly, "That scroll requires a complete structural lockdown. If she finished it, the lockdown would have triggered a full department audit. They would have found the alterations." "Exactly," Harry said. Wilkes panicked. He hired the mercenaries to take her out and frame it as an unstable experiment. He confessed to everything. He's currently sitting in a holding cell on level 2, crying about his pension. Draco stood up. He reached for his black jacket draped over the back of a chair. Will he face Azkaban? Draco asked. His voice was completely flat. 10 years, minimum, Harry replied. Attempted murder of a senior researcher, destruction of ministry property, and treason. We aren't offering him a plea deal. Good. Draco slid his arms into the jacket. The fabric pulled tight across his bandaged shoulder, but he ignored the protest of his healing skin. He checked his pockets for his wand, his ministry badge, and his keys. The protection detail is officially terminated, Harry said. He watched Draco carefully. The threat is neutralized. She's safe. I am aware of standard protocol, Potter. She's been cleared to return to work today. Harry added quietly. She's at the ministry. Draco froze for a fraction of a second. It was the only tell he allowed himself. He had spent the last 3 days lying in a hospital bed, gazing at the ceiling, trying to rebuild the fortress. He had tried to assemble the careful, detached professionalism that had defined his entire career. He had tried to convince himself that the dingy flat in South London was just the result of adrenaline and blood loss. It hadn't worked. The fortress was gone. It had burned to ash the moment he woke up and found her holding him on the cold hardwood floor, her hands stained with his blood. He didn't want the fortress anymore. Thank you for the debriefing, Draco said. He stepped past Harry, heading for the door. Malfoy. Harry called out. Draco paused, his hand on the handle. Harry wasn't smiling, but the grim aura mask had slipped. He looked like the boy who had once hated Draco, who had eventually learned to trust him, and who was now watching him walk directly into something dangerous. Don't mess this up, Harry said simply. Draco didn't reply. He opened the door and walked out into the corridor. The ministry atrium was a chaotic sea of noise and movement. Witches and wizards rushed past, arguing over memos, clutching briefcases, and shouting across the polished black floors. Draco ignored all of it. He didn't head for the golden elevators that would take him up to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. He walked directly to the heavy, iron-wrought gates at the far end of the atrium. The gates that led down. The descent into the Department of Mysteries was always cold. The ambient magic down here didn't feel like the rest of the ministry. It felt ancient. Heavy. It was a place designed to make people feel small. Draco stepped out of the lift into the long, dark corridor. The black-tiled walls reflected his sharp, solitary silhouette. He walked past the time room. He walked past the Hall of Prophecy. He didn't slow his pace. His heart was beating with a steady, rhythmic intensity that had nothing to do with combat. He turned the final corner. Lab 4 was a ruin. The heavy stone walls were partially collapsed. The structural wards were gone, leaving the space exposed to the quiet hum of the corridor. Ministry warders had set up temporary yellow barriers around the rubble, but no one was currently working on the site. Hermione Granger stood just outside the barriers. She wasn't wearing pajamas. She was wearing a crisp, dark blue pencil skirt and a white silk blouse. Her hair was pinned up in a neat, professional twist. She held a leather-bound clipboard in her hands. She looked entirely put together. She looked like a symbol again. Draco stopped 10 feet away from her. She hadn't noticed him yet. She was studying the rubble of her lab, the tip of her quill pressed thoughtfully against her lower lip. She was already calculating the required angles to rebuild the structural arches. He knew it. He didn't say anything, he just watched her. He had spent a decade doing exactly this. Watching her from a distance. Cataloguing her brilliance. Admiring her absolute, unyielding dedication to things that made sense. But he wasn't going to watch from a distance anymore. He took a step forward, his leather shoes clicking softly against the black tiles. Hermione turned. She went perfectly still. The clipboard in her hands lowered slightly. Her eyes, warm and impossibly expressive, locked onto his. She took in the crisp grey shirt, the black jacket, the pale, flawless line of his jaw. She looked at his left shoulder, tracking the hidden injury with a precision that made his pulse spike. "You were discharged," she said. Her voice was quiet, echoing slightly in the dark corridor. 30 minutes ago, Draco replied. He closed half the distance between them. He moved slowly. He didn't want to startle her, but he couldn't stand being 10 feet away from her. "You shouldn't be walking," she said, her academic reflex kicking in immediately. The necrotic countercurse requires a minimum of 5 days of sustained bed rest to ensure cellular stabilization. 3 days is entirely insufficient. My healer shares your opinion. Draco said. You ignored them. I found their arguments lacking. Hermione let out a short, breathy laugh. It was a beautiful sound. It bounced off the ruined stone walls of Lab 4, making the heavy air feel suddenly lighter. She didn't look like a symbol anymore. The pristine, professional veneer was cracking. She looked at him with an intensity that made it difficult for him to breathe. Harry told me about Wilkes, she said softly. The case is closed. Draco confirmed. He also said the protection detail was officially terminated. It is. Draco took another step. He was entirely inside her personal space now. He could smell the faint trace of vanilla and parchment that always seemed to cling to her. He could see the slight tremor in her hands where she gripped the clipboard. You're off duty, she noted. She didn't step back. She tilted her head up to look at him, her eyes tracing the lines of his face. Yes, Draco said. His voice dropped to a low, rough rasp. The tension between them wasn't cold anymore. It wasn't the high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled terror of the safe house, either. It was something entirely new. It was warm. It was heavy. It was the undeniable pull of a gravity they had both stopped fighting. Which means, Draco murmured, leaning down just a fraction of an inch. If I kiss you right now, I won't be violating Section 4 of the Magical Lore Enforcement Guidelines regarding the undue distress of a protectee. Hermione's breath hitched. She looked at his mouth. Then she looked back up at his eyes. I don't think I would find it distressing. She whispered. Draco didn't wait. He reached out. He didn't grab her wrist this time. He raised his right hand and gently cupped the side of her face. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, a slow, deliberate anchor. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't polite. It was a decade of suppressed devotion, fractured rules, and desperate survival, finally snapping into focus. He kissed her with absolute certainty. Hermione dropped the clipboard. It hit the floor with a sharp clatter that neither of them noticed. She brought both of her hands up, tangling her fingers in the lapels of his black jacket, pulling him closer. She kissed him back with the same fierce, unyielding intensity that she applied to everything she loved. Draco wrapped his uninjured arm tightly around her waist, anchoring her against him. He deepened the kiss, stealing her breath, entirely consumed by the warmth of her mouth and the frantic, beautiful rhythm of her pulse under his hand. They stood in the deep, quiet dark of the Department of Mysteries, surrounded by the shattered ruins of a cold, isolated life. They were finally on the same side. The long game was over. He had won. The end.